Hello and welcome to this video on figs, or more accurately, the kind of figs that come up when you use that ubiquitous name. This is something we've been guilty of in the past, with particular videos where we've pointed out that figs are a great species to use for bonsai. The problem is rather simple. The word fig, depending on who you ask and where you ask, could be a tree for which you get very different answers. This is especially true when we talk about bonsai. A ficus, or the genus or general umbrella under which all fig trees fall, is made up of over 850 different species. When you have 850 of anything, you either have confusion or a problem, and often both. For this video, we can broadly split figs into two different categories. That is, we can reasonably neatly split the myriad examples into eating figs, or essentially fruiting species, and those that are not necessarily seen as an eating or fruiting example. Typically speaking, members of the Ficus family or genus are reasonably easy to recognize. Many of them will develop aerial roots, which is perhaps what the bonsai form is most famous for, and they generally form a fairly distinct shape and habit. Further, you generally have fairly distinguishable fruit on them, whether it is the particular small forming variety of fig, which isn't necessarily great for eating, or the larger kind which is often seen only as a foodstuff. The flower itself is also somewhat unique. We say unique in that it's kind of weird. It has tiny flowers that develop into multiple tiny ovaries that essentially align the fruit once it's finally developed. Further to all of this, figs have a very unique is probably the correct word here, a way they get pollinated. Unlike most other species, figs don't rely on your typical pollinators. Instead, they have, in a manner of speaking, evolved to rely on particular and often very geographically narrowly tailored species of wasps. These are rather obviously called fig wasps. They're special for a simple reason. They're able to enter the tiny little flowering ovum-like structures, and these then allow for the pollination of the fig tree. Where you don't have these occurring, and this is often the case given the narrow geographical tailoring of the species, you effectively get sterile plants because there's no way to fertilize them. In broad terms, at least broad terms when we talk about flowering and fruiting figs, there's really only one common species that's readily available. It's the Ficus carica. Now, this is the kind of fig you would find throughout the Mediterranean region, and it's perhaps what they're more famous for in terms of fig production. It's a small tree and it's deciduous. It doesn't grow that big by comparison to some of its peers, at between 7 and 10 meters on average. This is about 20 to 30 feet, thereabouts in imperial units. It's generally made out of a smooth bark, and the colour will vary considerably. And typically speaking, you'll see it described as white, although the coloration can vary drastically. The leaves themselves tend to be made up of 3 to 5 rather big lobes, similar to a maple tree but much larger. The fruit itself is often starts out quite small, somewhere in the range of 3 to 5 centimeters, about 1 to 2 inches. The flesh will ripen over time as it gets more mature, and it will eventually darken and soften. Typically speaking, the fruit will ripen somewhere between late summer and early autumn. One of the reasons why they're particularly prevalent in the Mediterranean is that they are not tolerant of frost, although they can tolerate some. On the other hand, they do tolerate extreme heat much better. What's important is that, like all other members of the fig family, we use that term liberally here, they can cause contact irritation, essentially a minor allergic reaction. This is because, like all others, the Ficus carica carries a photodermatitis causing agent that reacts with ultraviolet light. Essentially, you get the sap from it on you, and then you get exposed to sunlight, and now you have something similar to a rash. Do remember that this is not just unique to the Mediterranean type of fig, but to all figs. And it's also noteworthy that although it's not considered exceptionally dangerous, and not classified as a poison, it is still recognized by most international poison-type agencies such as the FDA as at least being notable. In contrast to the, let's say, more typical eating-type fig, we have the more typical bonsai fig species. And now we can exemplify and demonstrate this with a Ficus benjamina, perhaps the most easy to see and understand, mostly because it's commonly called the weeping fig, the Benjamin fig, or the ficus tree. It's also often sold as just a ficus. It kind of tells you how typical they are. It is the most common example, let's say, when you have a fig tree that's just a fig tree and it doesn't produce any fruit. This is probably what you have in your hands or are looking at. It's found mostly throughout Asia and Australia, although you may see it elsewhere. Where the, let's say, eating fig, that being the Ficus carica, only grows to 7 to 10 meters, this can grow up to 30 meters, and that's roughly 100 feet. Unlike the Ficus carica, these are also not multi-lobed. Instead, there's essentially one long, almost ovoid, perhaps the word for it, a leaf that is somewhere between 6 and 13 centimeters, somewhere between roughly 2 and 6 inches. In this case, when you see them described as having a grey bark, typically this is going to be fairly consistent throughout all of the example species, compared at least to the Ficus carica. The other noteworthy effect is that where we talk about them in a wild scenario, they generally have leaves that grow wider and drop down in a more drooping manner. Unlike Ficus carica, the Ficus benjamina does produce fruit. However, the fruit is notably different. It's going to be orange to red coloured in most cases, and be more spherical, and often somewhere between 2 and 2.5 centimeters, which is more or less about 1 inch in size. In terms of its availability, it is typically far more readily available. In fact, it's often treated as an ornamental and even sold as an indoor species. That is, as an indoor species in general planting terms, not bonsai. The other noteworthy feature is that, unlike Ficus carica, it is arguably, let's say, somewhat more resilient. It doesn't require an excessive amount of water in summer, and during winter, when it's sort of semi-dormant, it really only needs enough water to keep it from becoming dry. The other noteworthy feature with this is that, let's say, unlike the more temperamental Ficus carica, it is more reliant on, let's say, the duration of light rather than temperature to decide when it's going to be active. The last example we have for you is perhaps less often seen, but when it is seen, it is arguably a rather stunning bonsai display piece. It's the banyan fig. This is also called Ficus benghalensis or Ficus indica. It's also sometimes just called the banyan fig or Indian banyan. It's, as the names would have suggested so far, a native to India and that part of the world. It's one of the largest trees in the world, although by large we're talking more about the ability of the canopy to cover an area, not so much for the actual tree itself, as you'll understand shortly. The notable feature here is that it grows reasonably tall and narrow initially, but it does so by strangling another tree, and we mean that quite literally. That's why it's also known as a strangling fig. It will, let's be blunt about this, it's effectively going to parasitize another tree by climbing up it and growing on it, and embedding itself into it and slowly outcompeting it and stealing all of its resources. You can think what you think, but just don't say it out loud. The other noteworthy feature here is that it doesn't necessarily start on the ground. Rather, the seeds are often dropped by birds that have eaten the fruit or semi-fruit of the banyan fig, and then they will germinate in various crevices and opportunities within another tree, and this is how they start growing in there and essentially parasitizing them. The roots will grow downwards from wherever they've started growing in that tree, and as they grow down, they will envelop and take over the host tree, and eventually kill it off. At the same time as the roots grow down, new branches will grow upwards, and try and outcompete the tree that they are parasitizing. Typically speaking, although not always, the original support tree will die, and this then leaves a hollow space internally, causing the banyan fig to become a columnar tree. Basically, the inside of it has become a hollow core, hence the name column, or columnar. Bringing it back to the original point of it being a wide tree, remember we've mentioned now that they drop roots down from where they grow in the original host tree, and they can do this basically from anywhere where the branches are growing. They don't have to be growing as a trunk per se. Instead, as the branches grow out to the side, they start dropping roots down, and these can form new supports, allowing the canopy to grow incredibly wide, but there isn't a massive trunk as such to support it. Rather, there are a whole bunch of aerial roots along branches along the way that provide that vertical support along with the horizontal strength of all those extra branches. It doesn't mean that there isn't strength, however. The various aerial roots, both those growing down and sort of growing up in the form of branches and other aerial roots, can fuse, and when this happens, they form a much larger, thicker structure. Like all the other figs we have mentioned though, they do contain the same issue regarding sap. That is, exposure to sap, then sunlight equals irritation. As you can see, the name fig does not mean much, and this video touches on just a handful of example species, and there are more than 800 others that we could have chosen from. And so when we say a ficus or a fig, we are being very generic and very general in what we're talking about. You could choose any number of different bonsai species, or more accurately ficus species, for bonsai, just based on that alone. And yes, there will be variation within that. It's obviously up to you as an individual to take a look at the particular species you're going to buy and go, this is going to be really cold, therefore this one's no good, or this one's going to be really hot, so I can probably do this, just as you would with any species. It's just that in terms of figs, there's considerably more variability. Thank you for watching this video. If you have found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions that you have below.